Box 4.1 Nicaraguan Sign Language. Or whatever. In 1979, the Sandinista National Liberation Front toppled the Nicaragua de facto ruler, Anastasio Somoza Debayle, whose family had been in power in the country since 1936. The new government brought in sweeping reform, including huge literacy campaign, support for special needs in education, and provision for deaf children. Prior to this, deaf children were unlikely to meet one another, and so had developed their own idiosyncratic gesture system to communicate with their families at home, known as home sign or senas. I don't know why they keep putting in these blooming foreign words. It doesn't mean anything, does it? Under the Sandinista government, children using these home signs, which varied considerably in their structure and complexity, were brought together for the first time in the context of vocational educational program aimed at deaf children and young adults in Managua, the capital. Interestingly, the children were told not to use gestures and were taught lip reading and Spanish, the dominant language of Nicaragua. However, by the mid-1980s, the deaf signers had developed their own sign language, which served as language input for deaf children who subsequently entered these programs. Recall that before these children, there wasn't any official sign language in Nicaragua. So the first group of deaf people to form this community did not learn a sign language from all the signers. Judy Kegg, a linguist based at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, began investigating the language in 1986 on the invitation of country's Ministry of Education to observe the children at the School of Managua and essentially work out the system of communication these children had invented. She made the first systemic video recording in 1987 and published the first scientific report of Nicaraguan Sign Language. Shortly thereafter, as part of her observation, often with young signers as willing research collaborators, Kegg noted a kind of reversal of pattern you would expect to see in typical language development. The younger members of the newly emerging NSL community were actually more fluent at the language, building on and going beyond the older speakers' linguistic abilities. Figure 4.3. Since Kegg's work, NSL continues to provide an important source of data for linguists, developmental psychologists, and anthropologists interested in how children learn language and the conditions necessary for language to evolve. It became particularly important in understanding the role of children's own inventiveness in the process of language creation as it happens in front of our eyes. It is also valuable because the political backdrop against which these children's lives played out created a rather unique natural experiment that would be difficult to formally replicate. Imagine trying to get approval from the University Ethics Board for a study that deprived children of language in order to examine how children might invent it. NSL shows that in a relatively short amount of time, a sophisticated language can develop in the communicative niche is not already served by existing language, and that the change is often driven by youngest members of that community. We take a deeper look at the sign language in chapter 16. Figure 4.3. Today, Nicaraguan Sign Language is fully fledged language of its own with a complex grammar and broad vocabulary, and it is still evolving. Talking point. Despite decades of research, we have only begun to understand how language acquisition works in a minority of the 7,000 languages of the world. For too long, the field has been overly reliant on the monolingual English speakers, and we don't know whether the developmental process are significantly different in other languages because researchers simply haven't studied most of them in depth. This situation is made more urgent by the rate at which languages are disappearing. It is estimated over 40% of the world's languages are at risk of extinction. Not only does this represent an enormous loss of cultural identity, values, heritage, wisdom, and accumulated medical, ecological, and technical know-how from a scientific perspective, it also severely limits our understanding of what language can be and what makes us human. Language diversity manifests itself not just at the global level, but at the level of individual children too. Growing up with two or more languages is the norm for the most of the world's children, and this represents another sense in which setting monolingual English acquisition as the default can skew our understanding. If we want to understand how children acquire any language, then we need to take diversity seriously and not treat English as a standard against which other languages are compared. Imagine if we had experimental and experiential data from all 7,000 languages at our fingertips. How much richer would our understanding be of the language is and how we acquire it? You wouldn't. It's just like having a 1,000-piece jigsaw with 1,000 pieces that don't match together. So you don't even have a jigsaw. Summary: before birth and after, children are becoming sensitized to the sounds in their native language and insensitive to those that are not. Children have powerful pattern detection skills to segment speech streams into the words. Child-directed speech differs in important ways from adult to adult speech and has been shown to help language learning. Cross-linguistically, the types of first words children use show some similar characteristics and some differences shaped by cognitive, social, and linguistic factors. Children learn grammar incrementally by blending simple grammar and expresses simple ideas like agent action and action object into more complex forms like agent action object. Through their play, exploration, and social interaction, children use a variety of strategies to understand what words mean. Overgeneralization errors are powerful illustrations of creative power of language and the mechanism children use to learn it. I think that's a load of rubbish, to be honest. All these bits that aren't actually words, and you said this bit and then that bit and then that bit, and that's a load of rubbish. Just overcomplicating it for no reason. Which you're told not to. Supposed to be clear and simple.